Gordon Curran, and I'm welcoming you to the professional lecture series, which we hold almost monthly during the academic year at the Bowen Center. I'm a professional volunteer that gets speakers for these meetings, and all ideas are welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Collier, or Dr. Carrie Collier, who is our director of the Bowen Center, for some comments.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And I just want to welcome Dr. Eben Alexander this evening and Curran for connecting him with the Bowen Center. We have a new website, thebowencenter.org. And if you go there, you will see that we have a faith leadership conference tomorrow. And then we have other conferences, but I want to just put a shout out for our spring conference, which is called Unlocking the Mystery of the Family Emotional System. And so it's great. I can see some people out there that I haven't seen in a while, and I also see some new people. And I took a look at the registration list, and this is just this list is so wide and varied, and I'm just really excited to have everyone here tonight and to be here myself. So thank you. Go right ahead, Anne.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Alexander, but I'm trying to find out how to get back to my comments. I had them a minute ago. How do I get back to my Windows without losing the Zoom?
I don't know what your screen looks like. You can just minimize the Zoom.
Or perhaps you click on.
There it is. There it is. Exit full.
It's found.
I couldn't find it. It just wouldn't show up.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Murray Bowen developed a theory of family systems emotional functioning, which includes 8 concepts in an effort to describe how the family as a unit can be understood as a science of the human. He based his ideas in the natural sciences, showing how all living organisms function similarly. He also considered a 9th concept, which he initially called spiritual phenomena, but found that would get confused with religion and philosophy, so called it supernatural phenomena, to describe human behavior outside the laws of nature. He never had time to develop this concept. A year ago, I read Proof of Heaven, a Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, which was written in 2012 by Dr. Eben Alexander, neurologist and neurosurgeon. I was intrigued by the detail and information about his illness and journey into deep coma, revealing information he did not know about his life prior to this occasion. He was hospitalized while having a grand mal seizure and was later diagnosed with E. coli gram-negative bacterial meningitis and remained in coma for 6 days, returning on the 7th. He experienced an odyssey in another realm entirely, with no memory during those coma days of another life before. He experienced a complete shutdown of his neocortex. It was inoperative, in essence, absent. He had no consciousness. Dr. Alexander graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1976 with a master's in chemistry and obtained his medical degree at Duke University Medical School in 1980. He completed residency training at Duke, Massachusetts General Hospital, and Harvard with a focus on neuroendocrinology. He then completed a fellowship in cerebrovascular neurosurgery in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. He was on the faculty of Harvard Medical School for 15 years as associate professor of surgery, specializing in neurosurgery. In 2006, Dr. Alexander and his wife and 2 sons moved to Lynchburg to be closer to family, and he commuted to Charlottesville to work at the Focused Ultrasound Surgery Foundation. He was instrumental in helping to develop magnetic resonance image-guided neurosurgical procedures. He wrote both papers and book chapters and spoke worldwide during this time. It was in 2008 that he experienced his NDE, near-death experience, while in deep coma. The incredible outcome is that Dr. Alexander recouped completely over the weeks to come and returned to his responsibilities as a surgeon for a couple of years before moving to Charlottesville in 2012. He no longer sees patients as he found it difficult to be fully present with them while also pursuing his new direction as a pioneering scientist and modern thought leader. Dr. Alexander was named again to the prestigious Watkins Mind Body Spirit List 2020, which also includes the Dalai Lama, Pope Francis, Eckhart Tolle, and Desmond Tutu. He has done hundreds of media interviews on all the major networks and international radio, digital, and podcast interviews as well. His books are sold in more than 40 countries and many, many languages. At the beginning of chapter 2 of his last book, Dr. Alexander quotes Nick Herbert, physicist, in saying, quote, "Science's biggest mystery is the nature of consciousness," end quote. This has become Dr. Alexander's focus as he explores the role that consciousness plays in wellness and recovery, and a way to understand more fully mind-body awareness, practices, and function for a fuller life and death experience. Let us welcome Dr. Alexander, who will present on NDEs and consciousness.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, for that nice introduction. I'd like to move through this and kind of share with you an extraordinary kind of life transformation, in many ways a reversal from my life before, due not only to my near-death experience that happened in 2008, but also largely to the 12 years, almost 13 years now since that time that I've spent working with other scientists around the world studying the fundamental nature of consciousness. And so it really has led me into some exciting new territory, and that's really what I'd like to share. I was not very familiar with the Bowen Center before, but I've enjoyed what I've read about it and certainly see a significant amount of overlap in our thinking. So I think we can help each other along in this whole process. Now, starting out, important to point out, I'd grown up in a neurosurgical family. My father was very scientific. He was the chairman of a neurosurgical training program, but he was also very religious. He had a profound belief in God and the power of prayer. And I would say it figured in a lot in his work as a neurosurgeon. Growing up like many in the 60s and 70s, I knew that science is the pathway to truth. And I promise you, I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. But I've also come to realize that kind of mechanistic view of the material world that I thought before my coma was the be-all and end-all of understanding human events, I've come to realize was very much in error. And it has to do with the relationship between brain and mind, the nature of consciousness, and that's where we want to go with this. Now, my own personal experience involved, as you heard, bacterial E. coli meningoencephalitis. It involved all 8 lobes of my brain. So there really was no place left, no neocortex certainly, that could be participating in any kind of conscious experience. And yet what I experienced in my coma was by far the most ultra real, meaningful, powerful, profound, memorable set of activities in my entire existence. So how did that happen when my brain was so, in such a documented fashion, was so damaged that it really could not have mustered a dream or hallucination or anything? Those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize I shared some of the medical details in that book, especially in an appendix. And to me, Proof of Heaven, the book, is really a big question mark. It admits these experiences that millions have described over thousands of years. And basically says, yes, they're real, but how do we explain them? And my focus as a scientist is how to understand it from a scientific perspective. But I'll tell you up front that ultimately what I have found is that we are basically spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, and to deny, kind of our spiritual nature in many ways completely denies the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Now, there is a medical case report on my medical records that came out long after the book Proof of Heaven. It was written by 3 physicians who were not involved in my care, but they were fascinated by my recovery, because there's no question my case for any physician is an extreme challenge. How in the world I could recover from that illness, basically over 2 months back to normal. In fact, in many ways, I was better than I had been before. And that part is very hard to understand, but it has a tremendous amount to do with our kind of spiritual essence and the role that that can play in healing. And that's where I really want to go with this as we move along. The journey, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on my NDE itself. The book Proof of Heaven tells that story fully. But the important things for this discussion have to do with the various spiritual features that I encountered. I'll get to that in just a second. I wanted to finish by saying that the medical case report on my medical records by Dr. Surbikana and others appears in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September of 2018. And anyone can access that medical case report. If you go to ebenalexander.com, that's my website, go to the blog postings for September 2018, and you'll find a blog that's devoted entirely to that case report on my medical records. Really astonishing. They went a lot further than I did in documenting the amount of damage to my brain and kind of their surprise that I could recover from this. And in fact, when the medical peer reviewers challenged the authors and said, well, this case really doesn't line up. The word they used was, they said it's absurd that someone this ill would end up having a full recovery. And the way that the authors satisfied them was, they said it's because he had the near-death experience. That's what allowed this phenomenal, profound, unexpected, and what some people might call a miraculous recovery. I don't really like the word miracle, because I think there's a lot more to it than that, and a lot more ways that our will can have an influence in this. It's important to point out that in my journey, I was amnesic. I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life. And that is a very unusual feature for a near-death experience. Even though most of the qualities of my NDE were right on the kind of mark of an absolutely classic NDE, if you use what's known as the Grayson scale. The Grayson scale has 16 elements, maximum value of 32 is the max score. And my score was 29 out of 32. So it's extremely powerful as a transcendental near-death experience. But the only reason I really lost points and didn't get a perfect score was my amnesia. Now, when I first came back to this world, none of my neurosurgical knowledge was there, but over weeks and months, as that knowledge came back, and as I was kind of revisiting my memories, because the one thing I never lost was my memories of what happened in the experience. But it was a big mystery to me how those memories all came back. Initially, I explained it all by saying, well, I knew from what the doctors told me about the damage to my neocortex. And given the general idea in neuroscience that the neocortex is involved in memory, long-term memory storage, even though there's been some doubt about that in recent decades, that was my default explanation for that early complete loss of memories. But then imagine my surprise when those memories came back completely over about 2 months. And we'll get into that in a little while about memories, because in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we actually go into detail about how memories are not even stored in the brain. And as a neuroscientist trained in formal neuroscience, I can tell you that was a big statement to go that far, to realize that memories are not stored in the brain at all. But that became very clear to me from my experience, and also, as you'll hear from a lot of the scientific work I've done with other scientists around consciousness since that time. Now, in many ways, my case was a perfect model for human death. And so that's why these events, what I did know when I woke up on day 7 of that coma, was where I'd just been, this extraordinary journey. And again, that whole story is there in Proof of Heaven, but briefly it started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. It was like being in dirty jello. I have a strong memory of roots or blood vessels all around me. And then that seemed to go for ages. I had no memory of anything else. I had no words or language. People, when I would talk about this early on after my experience, would ask me, was that earthworm eye view some kind of hell or purgatory? Well, I think hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And this was none of that. Even though I had no language and no words, I could still wonder, what, where, how? And there was never a flicker of a response from the world around me. Luckily, it did not last forever. I was rescued by a slowly spinning white light that came as a kind of a perfect musical melody. And it opened up like a wormhole or a portal up into this rich, ultra-real Gateway Valley. And that Gateway Valley had a lot of Earth-like features. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. At no point in this journey did I have any body awareness. There was never a sense of a body. A speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies all looping and spiraling in vast formations. And then below us in this gorgeous meadow, gorgeous beyond description, were thousands of people dancing. And when I came back to this world weeks later and writing it all up, I said they were souls between lives. That was my impression of who these beings were. But there was a lot of joy and festivity. As I said, this valley was absolutely gorgeous. There was no sign of any death or decay. Plant life, buds, blossoms on trees, opening up in rich, dynamic, very tactile fashion. And it was just an absolutely gorgeous scene. It was being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs, pure spiritual beings leaving sparkling trails against a blue-black velvety sky. And those orbs were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, I called them angelic choirs, because to me, that's really the best description for what was going on there, what was fueling all those festivities. And I remember this kind of soft summer breeze that blew through, and it was my, I called it in my writings, a divine wind or the breath of God. That was my first knowing of the God force, of pure love and healing and wholeness. And what makes that a true spiritual home is the extreme comfort. That's what so many near-death experiencers have come in touch with, is that God force of pure love that is not judgmental, but very kind of comforting, soothing, reassuring. It's nurturing in just a beautiful way. And that breath of God, that was my first awareness of that. And then I realized that all the lower material realms down below, this layer of spiritual reality, with a completely different ordering of time, was all part of that world with that divine loving force going all through it. And I remember the choirs above, those chants and hymns that were coming down, they turned into yet another portal. So another major theme of my journey was the fact that what I remembered as music, now of course, none of these sounds were being heard by ears. None of what I was seeing was being seen by eyes. People have a misunderstanding of NDEs. They think that a near-death experience is very kind of murky and dreamlike. This is dreamlike. The material world we live in is the dream, because in fact, that reality is much more real. It's kind of astonishing. And people have done scientific studies of the quality of memories from NDEs and are quite astonished. They rival any other memories we ever have from real or imagined life events as being very strong and stable memories over decades. So it's really, it's not a hallucination or dream. These are profound spiritual journeys that have a tremendous amount of import to all of us, especially when you realize, as I did, I'd never read the NDE literature before, but after my own case, my son, who was majoring in neuroscience at the time, and came home from college, and he had been there when I was deep in coma. So he was just astonished that I was making this recovery. And he came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital. And I remember he gave me a big hug, and he told me later it was like he could see this light shining within me, as if I was far more present than I'd ever been before. And I remember what I told him that morning. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 2008. And I said, my experience was way too real to be real. I was still shocked by the ultra reality of the entire experience. I mean, to me, that was evidence of something really extraordinary, even though my doctors tried to talk me out of it. Of course, they said the dying brain can play all kinds of tricks when I was trying to explain it to them. So they told me it had to be a vast hallucination. Now, my knowledge of neuroscience had not yet come back. Very little of it was back. It took 2 months for all of that to come back. But in the coming weeks, as that knowledge came back, it collided with the strength of those memories of what had happened deep in coma, especially as I learned more and more about my medical records and talking it over with my doctors. That the scan showed all 8 lobes of my brain were affected. Neurologic exams showed my neocortex to be in horrible trouble, even in the first few hours. My brainstem was badly damaged, according to that neurologic exam. The lab values were horrific. If you read that case report, you'll see what I mean. I mean, this cerebrospinal fluid glucose level, which in most people is going to be 60 to 80. In somebody with a bad case of meningitis, it might go as low as 20. My CSF glucose was 1. This was a terrific case of bacterial meningoencephalitis that absolutely should have killed me. And that's why having such an extraordinary experience and then being able to muster this complete recovery over 2 months certainly should garner attention. And it got my attention tremendously. So now what I'd like to do is share more of that. The Gateway Valley, it turns out, was only kind of a halfway point, because those angelic choirs provided yet another portal. And that was to what I call the core. That was, as far as I went on this journey, was the core realm, but it was pretty far. And to get there, I had to witness all of 4-dimensional space-time in this material universe collapsing down. And then all of that spiritual realm, the Gateway Valley that I had just encountered, and saw all of that shrink down and collapse. And then that was what left me to the core. And in the core, all of that collapse of the material and spiritual worlds was presented to me as this complex oversphere as part of the teaching. That was, in the core realm, some of the deepest lessons occurred. And that includes certainly my visions that saw life reviews, saw reincarnation. It turns out that life review is a very important concept in this discussion. The life review is something that goes back in near-death experiences, at least to the time of Plato, who wrote about the Armenian soldier who was killed in battle 2,400 years ago, and out on the battlefield dead for days. And when they finally put him up on a funeral pyre, he came back to life. And what he told his fellow soldiers is, when you die, your life flashes before your eyes, because he had a full life review. And he said the only thing that matters in that process is how much love you have managed to bring to the world. This from an Armenian soldier killed in battle 2,400 years ago. And that could be the same story told by an Iraqi war veteran today, having this extraordinary vision, going through life review, through the most crucial aspects of your life. And the important thing to understand about the life review is it's not really from your own personal perspective. Most people describe a life review as being one where they're aware of the emotional kind of impact that their actions and even their thoughts had on others around them. And this is kind of extraordinary, but it shows us how the boundaries of self in many ways are a fiction that are there to support this beautiful journey of life, where we're interacting with our fellow beings. But we generally think that our mind and our mental contents are separate from other people. But in the modern world of consciousness studies, that is not so true. In fact, you can demonstrate telepathy. Telepathy is probably easiest to demonstrate in identical twins. There's a beautiful book by Guy Léon Playfair called Twin Telepathy. I can highly recommend. He estimates that 35% of identical twins have strong telepathic experiences. They can be so strong that one twin might touch a hot stove, and the other twin 1,000 miles away might develop a blister and feel pain. That's a very strong connection. So telepathy is one example of how our minds kind of overlap. Likewise, remote viewing. Remote viewing is a field it's sometimes referred to as the psychic spy program, the Stargate program in the US. Other countries had intelligence programs with remote viewers. It's been statistically demonstrated to be a real effect by none less than Jessica Utts, the head of the American Statistical Association back in 2015, who gave a talk to more than 6,000 statisticians and scientists at that meeting, where she discussed how remote viewing had been proven beyond any kind of reasonable doubt. And yet most of her scientific colleagues wouldn't believe in it. And when she would challenge them, they'd say, well, they didn't even waste their time studying the scientific literature on it. And she said, well, that doesn't sound very scientific. But it turns out that when asked what they would prefer, more data or a personal experience, they all wanted a personal experience. So that is really, that reflects a lot of where Karen is my partner, Karen Newell, she's my life partner and also the co-author of my third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And that's really where we go with all this, it's personal experience. And it's really through meditation. Because I realized within a year and a half, 2 years of my coma, that the only way to understand any of this that I'd been through deep in coma was to explore consciousness through meditation. So that's what I started doing. I found out early on about binaural beats, which is a form of sound where you put in one tone to one ear, a slightly different tone to the other ear. And this was a process that was first discovered by a Prussian physicist in the mid 19th century. But what has been discovered in the 20th century was that process of the binaural beats, that kind of wavering sensation that comes from that process of slightly different frequencies to the two ears, can lead to profound changes in conscious awareness. And for example, Robert Monroe, who was well known for investigating out-of-body experiences, found that binaural beats could greatly enhance that process. Likewise, some of the scientists involved in remote viewing found that binaural beat brainwave entrainment could greatly enhance the ability to remote view. And so that's really what Karen and I were pursuing. And I was specifically pursuing meditation with binaural beats because to me, it sounded like a very powerful tool for allowing us to kind of separate our conscious awareness from the normal processes of consciousness when we're in the body. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through this. But for now, I want to get back to kind of the center of the challenge of my journey of realizing that when my brain was so effectively offline with such documented medical evidence, how was it I was having such an ultra-real spiritual experience? And those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize what a gigantic challenge that was to me. What I can tell you is since then, I've had to go through a fundamental process of questioning everything I ever thought I knew about the nature of reality. And I really had to go back to square one and start over and realize this is all about the brain-mind connection. But very importantly, also realizing that in many ways, this world around us, this physical world, is only one realm of many that we have access to as sentient beings. And of course, most of us are used to the dream space. We have that every night to interact with the dream space. And I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap of that space with what I experienced in my NDE. Likewise, I would say there's a tremendous amount of overlap with what is uncovered in psychedelic, plant medicine type experiences. So I think, but I also believe from my own personal kind of comparison of such experiences with my near-death experience, that the psychedelic drugs really only give you a tiny glimpse through a keyhole. They do not give you the much bigger kind of penthouse panoramic vision that you get through a near-death experience. But far better than the psychedelics is what I think we can accomplish through meditation with powerful tools like sacred acoustics. And I know, for example, that Christopher Bache, B-A-C-H-E, in his book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, did a direct comparison of binaural beat brainwave entrainment for spiritual journeying with his own personal process of high-dose LSD for spiritual journeying. And in his book, in Dark Night, Early Dawn, he goes so far as to say you can make at least as much progress with the brainwave entrainment and the sounds as you can with the LSD. And I think that's an important point. From my viewpoint, the psychedelic drugs are really only having mainly a minimal effect on mainly on your neocortex. That's where most of those serotonin receptors are that those LSD, DMT, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and other similar psychedelic substances have an impact. And in contradistinction, when you're using binaural brainwave entrainment, you're actually using sounds that are influencing the lower brainstem, circuits that arose more than 300 million years ago. And I believe that's one of the reasons why in our workshops and in our experience of people who use sacred acoustics and stay in touch with Curran about the experiences they have, that we're finding kind of extraordinary ability of people to reunite with their higher soul, kind of traverse that veiling function of the brain, and really get into some healing soul work. I'll point out in the same context that another current use of such psychedelic substances are several medical studies showing using psilocybin, magic mushrooms, in patients who have a severe fear of death, cancer patients. Also, psilocybin has been used for extreme addictions like nicotine addiction, opioid addiction, alcoholism, things like that. And it turns out that one dose of psilocybin in the proper therapeutic setting can be very powerful for months and even years in alleviating that fear of death or in helping people address those strong addiction issues. Now, as many of you are aware, there's this whole concept in addiction work and alcoholism of 12-step programs of turning it over to a higher power so that we're not leaving it up to the ego mind to kind of guide our life. The ego certainly gets us into a lot of trouble. That was one of the beautiful lessons of my journey, is realizing that, you know, the ego voice, the little voice in my head that was completely eradicated during my journey. It's very liberating to do that. And of course, in my meditation, the first thing I try to do is put that little ego voice into timeout. I love it how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that little voice the voice in our head, our running stream of thoughts, the annoying roommate. And that's a beautiful way to look at it, an important way to look at it. That is not who we are. So in deep meditation, you know, I acknowledge that right up front, that little linguistic voice in my head, that ego, I can kind of honor it for doing what it does, but then I put it into time out. Because in fact, the deep mystery of consciousness is not that little voice. The little voice is little more than a parlor trick. And as a neurosurgeon who's operated on a lot of patients using what are called awake craniotomies, for example, if they had a tumor or vascular lesion near their speech areas, we would operate on them awake. And we do that because the brain feels no pain. You anesthetize the scalp, you can do this opening and then in a sedated patient, and then you can lighten them up and they can participate. And so I realized as a neurosurgeon, that little voice in the head is a tiny part of the brain. It's certainly not who we are, although many of us treat it that way. And in meditation, I put that little voice into timeout because it's the awareness of existence that is the deep mystery of consciousness. And in fact, in meditation, we can start developing that awareness we have and that connection with that higher soul that's a far more profound and deeply interconnected part of the universe than our little ego mind is. And that's where I think we can start to make tremendous progress in healing. So in many ways, a lot of this becomes something of an issue of semantics and definitions, you know, of God, of consciousness. And certainly I will admit that there are a lot of unconscious processes that also play a role in all this, in this discussion of consciousness. And yet they're really all part of the same package. And we have ways of addressing and accessing all of it. And this is really in many ways my kind of understanding that's come out of all this, especially in realizing the brain does not create consciousness. But I've come to favor a view that I know other scientists and consciousness studies are paying a lot more attention to, and that's really the brain as a filter, as a transceiver. And of course, that's not a new idea. That's an idea that William James had back in the early 20th century as the professor of psychology at Harvard, studying a lot of very profound spiritual experiences. And he knew that F.C.S. Schiller had discussed this notion of the brain as a filter and that consciousness might be more primordial. And he was very much in favor of that. There were other people, Henri Bergson in France, Aldous Huxley in the US in later decades, all talking about the brain as a filter or a transceiver, but not as the originator of consciousness. And what I've come to realize is not only is it not the originator of consciousness, it's not even the repository for long-term memory storage. And that's where all this gets very interesting. And that's where we really have to start talking about these other realms and where is that information stored? I mean, I think the best answer I would give for that right now is what I'd call the quantum hologram, which is really the kind of theater of all potential for all events that could happen in our lives. And that's where our free will is active, because we select a certain pathway that allows some of those events to truly manifest and others not. But I would say that this whole worldview shift that I've had to go through has really involved what I call consilience. Consilience is the notion that if we look at a deep problem from widely different and disparate perspectives, that we get better information about understanding it. And here, what we're talking about is studying consciousness. That is phenomenal awareness. What all of us are used to is just this existing and living and experiencing life. And it turns out that this consilience involves many different fields. It involves neuroscience and what is called the hard problem of consciousness. That, of course, I think most of you are probably familiar with. That was something that was defined in those terms by David Chalmers, the Australian philosopher, in his 1996 book, The Conscious Mind. And of course, the hard problem of consciousness had been brewing for decades. And many scientists had contributed to this extremely deep mystery in trying to relate the workings of the brain with what happens in human phenomenal experience, and having great difficulty with it. The hard problem is actually an impossible problem for materialist science. There is no way to move from the physical world and the material brain into fully explaining consciousness without understanding there's much more at play. And that in fact, you really do best by seeing consciousness as a primordial constituent of the universe that predates and exists outside of things like the Big Bang. Our whole observable universe is something that exists within that consciousness, that primordial mind. So neuroscience is one field. Philosophy of mind is another, especially, for example, the binding problem, this whole issue of the apparent uniformity of consciousness in any individual. Everything that I smell and touch and see and hear, and all of my executive function and all of my memories, all of that is coming together into one unified consciousness. So how is that? How in the world could a physical system like the brain unify consciousness in such a way? Well, it's a big challenge, and the best answer to that actually ends up being that the consciousness is primordial. It's already unified. In fact, the more interesting question is, how is it parcellated out into our individual senses of consciousness? And I would say that occurs mainly through a process of dissociation. Now, in addition to neuroscience, the hard problem, to philosophy of mind, the binding problem, you also have all of the evidence in parapsychology for non-local consciousness. And that starts with what I mentioned a few minutes ago with telepathy, remote viewing. You have the whole category of near-death experiences, of shared death experiences. For example, there's a book on near-death experiences called The Self Does Not Die that came out a few years ago. And that is a beautiful book with more than 100 cases of veridical perceptions in NDEs that really have no explanation in Western medicine. So, NDEs, shared death experiences, another category of the kind of from the parapsychological world that contribute to this consilience of information around neuroscience and philosophy of mind, trying to tease out how the brain and mind and phenomenal human experience, all of these things are interrelated. And then there's the one of the biggest kind of fields of study in non-local consciousness is all the evidence, for example, out of University of Virginia. There are other places that study this, but at uvadops.org, you can learn a lot more if you're not already aware of this. But the group, the Division of Perceptual Studies there, has studied past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation for 60 years now, and profound, more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children, where the best explanation is actually of reincarnation. And that's after deep kind of scientific study to validate the facts of the case, et cetera. But reincarnation, from my point of view, and I think from the viewpoint of many of those scientists, has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. So we really have to entertain a much bigger theater of operations in considering what we're trying to explain in terms of human experience and relationship of brain and mind. The other thing in terms of the consilience is quantum physics itself, because those who study quantum physics, when you review the history of it, you realize people like Wolfgang Pauli, Erwin Schrödinger, Eugene Wigner, John von Neumann, Pascual Jordan, and others, all were so shocked by the experiments of quantum physics because of what they said about consciousness. And so what all these founding fathers said was, you cannot get behind consciousness. It does not seem to be something generated by the physical brain. But if you look at the physics of the very world around us, and the most proven field in the history of science is quantum physics, and yet at its base, at the base of these experiments, is a very profound mystery about how all that can work. I think it was David Bohm who was one of the first people addressing this as a quantum physicist, and specifically the issue they're talking about is the measurement paradox. That is that the choices, the free will choices of the observing scientist play a tremendous role in what ends up resulting from those experiments. And in fact, John Wheeler at Princeton was so shocked by all this. He was one of the leaders in quantum physics. And he came up with what he called the participatory anthropic principle. And basically that principle was noting with great kind of shock and amazement the role of mind and free will in kind of causing certain determinations of output that really in many ways prove that consciousness is not being created by the physical brain at all. And in the last few decades, increasingly refined experiments in quantum physics have gone all the way to the point where, as we argue in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, the best conclusion from these experiments and from trying to understand quantum physics in the modern era is that consciousness is fundamental in the universe, that mind over matter is the way all of this works. And, you know, when you get right down to it, in medicine, we've known this for decades. What is our gold standard for looking at any new treatment? Placebo effect, a placebo-controlled trial. And that can even be done in some procedures. For example, a paper a few 3 or 4 years ago from England, where they were looking at coronary artery catheterizations and stenting. And they did a sham procedure to compare, and they found that, in fact, the placebo effect, the patient's belief, was as powerful as the placing of the stent. You know, placebo effect and a patient's belief, thoughts, and attitudes, we've admitted for decades in medicine, are very capable of healing and of leading to wholeness and health. And for those who think this is just about taking sugar pill in curing a headache, I would encourage you to go to noetic.org. That's the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, and put in the search term spontaneous remission. You will find a book there that they published in the mid-90s. It's now out of print, but you can download the entire book for free and legally from their site. And they're now, I've just heard recently in discussions with the IONS group, they are now updating that whole database. So they've got 25 years more of data to add to it. But even at that time in the mid-90s, they had uncovered 3,500 cases of people with advanced cancers, infections, some with congenital deformities, others with advanced degenerative diseases that were able to heal themselves beyond any effect of Western medicine through their power of belief. And if you go through that data set, I think you'll be as impressed as I was with the incredible work they've done in showing the power of people's beliefs and ability to heal. So it really kind of opens the door wide to seeing the full-blown power of placebo effect and of our will to influence the unfolding reality. Now, in many ways in this discussion of brain, mind, and consciousness, it's not like we're talking about anything so new. For example, Wilder Penfield, one of the most renowned neurosurgeons in the 20th century, wrote a book in 1975 summarizing his career. And much of his career had involved stimulating brains, awake patients, as I mentioned a little while ago, doing awake craniotomies. I've done many of those. He focused his career on that and was a very good scientific investigator. And in fact, in 1975, in his book, The Mystery of the Mind, he makes it very clear the brain does not produce consciousness. He was fully aware of too many cases in his patients, of events that he'd witnessed, all of his attempts to map memory and map the brain electrically. He'd come to realize that memories were not stored, certainly not in the neocortex, although at the end of his life, he thought they might be stored in the brainstem, because he didn't realize at that time that you really had to leave physicalism or materialism or the physical universe behind in terms of fully explaining consciousness. And this is not just talking about, you know, the supernatural and the spiritual. If you consider consciousness part of the natural world, we're really just talking about the natural world and various different realms that we have access to. That's the way I'd rather put it. But I love it the way Penfield, he makes it crystal clear in that book that the mind cannot be fully explained by the brain at all. And he said this gave him great hope as a neuroscientist because of the spiritual nature of humanity. And for him, that was a tremendous relief. It turns out that you know, placebo effect is in many ways just the tip of the iceberg, because then you run into other spiritual healing, especially in some near-death experiences. Just as I mentioned earlier, that's how those physicians who wrote up my case report got that all into publication, was by pointing out that the NDE was what allowed me to have this profound recovery. So this is really just kind of getting us into that territory of mind over matter, and just how far can we go with that? It's very empowering to the individual and to the world at large, the more we can realize this. And of course, what most near-death experiencers will tell you is that in these realms that we visit, this kind of ultimate realm of ultimate reality on these journeys, in looking back on our life and going through this life reviews, every bit of that, is realizing that we're spiritual beings. And that is where I think the meditation and centering prayer, from my perspective, what I've seen in our workshops has been very valuable in seeing where people can go with this. And I think the whole world at large, in many ways, just as we talk about in addiction medicine, you talk about a gift of desperation. Well, in many ways, we're all facing a collective gift of desperation today. And it's not just the COVID pandemic and the economic collapse and a lot of the mental challenge that that has presented to us. But in many ways, I think you can look back on our society and what's happened in the last few centuries with the rise of materialist science and its lead. The problem with that materialist perspective and the notion of brain creates consciousness was this false notion of separation, that we're all separate from each other. And that's kind of the hallmark of reductive materialist science. And yet I would say that this new emergent kind of view of consciousness, with consciousness is fundamental, that takes this consilience from neuroscience, philosophy of mind, quantum physics, parapsychology, psychology, every bit of it, and tries to build up this bigger model of the primacy of consciousness and kind of the will of that one mind. And each and every one of us is a facet. I like to talk of the one mind as like the big diamond with all these facets, and each and every one of us, a sentient being, is a facet on the diamond, but we're all participating. We're kind of using that one mind, that one consciousness that's revealed to us very fully in a near-death experience when we become one with that God force of pure love, when we go through those life reviews and realize that the boundaries of self in many ways are artificial, or set up to support the drama of living these lives together and of learning the lessons we're here to learn, but ultimately coming to realize that we're dreaming the dream of the one mind. And this is all something that I think our society will benefit from, this awakening of humanity to this deep truth and worldview change. I know one of the ways that that Curran and I have tried to take this message to the world in a profound fashion, and this might be something of interest, especially those of you who are actively involved in treating and mental health for people around you. We developed a course with Dr. Anna Yusum. Dr. Yusum is a psychiatrist in Manhattan. In fact, she did a pilot study with binaural beats with sacred acoustics. And that pilot study was published in February of this year, of 2020, in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. And in that pilot study, what she found was that 26% of her patients had a reduction in anxiety and depressive symptoms over 2 weeks' time using sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment, just in the listening, without much in the way of a therapeutic setup around it. They found great relief and benefit just from the kind of peace and the kind of traversing of the veil and connection with higher soul that these tones enabled them. And so with Dr. Yusum, Curran and I have recorded a video course that is available. It's 9 hours total content. It's called Spirituality in Mental Health. And it can be accessed by anyone interested at the website becomingmorewhole.com. That's one word, becomingmorewhole.com. And by way of comparison, in Dr. Yusum's study, as I said, 26% reduction in those who listened to these tones over 2 weeks, whereas the control group only had a 7% benefit. And if you read her paper, you'll see a tremendous amount of additional kind of quality remarks she makes about the experiences of her patients. And all this is especially important. Not only is the COVID pandemic and the economic collapse causing a tremendous amount of mental health issues, but that's all on the heels of a really severe crisis in this world. And I'm sure those of you involved in mental health provision realize that we had an epidemic of suicide and of opioids wiping people out. In fact, for the first time in 100 years, our actuarial survival curves were suppressed. And by 2015 or so, this actually won a Nobel Prize in economics for Angus Deaton and his wife, Ann Case, was their reporting on this tremendous kind of epidemic of suicide and opioid death that we had in this country. Suicides increased by something like 26% from 1999 to 2015. The opioid crisis in 2017 claimed 72,000 lives. And of course, since the COVID pandemic, a lot of this has just worsened. So we really are in a kind of a crisis mode at this time, but I fully believe, just like in the world of addiction studies, where you talk about that, hitting the bottom, having a gift of desperation, I truly believe that we are in the process of a collective gift of desperation at this time. And I'm very optimistic about where we can go with it. That optimism comes from my knowing of where the scientific revolution in the nature of consciousness is going. Religious systems have been around for 5,000 years or more to try and teach us some of these deep lessons of living together, of morals and ethics, so that we can have a very high functioning society. And yet the track record with religious systems has been somewhat mixed. And in some cases, it's even led to more problem than solution, especially with some of the conflicts of superficial dogma, religious wars and violence between religious sects, that kind of thing. I believe that one of the ultimate results of this revolution in the neuroscience of consciousness and our understanding of the brain-mind relationship will be a complete revolution in our kind of human society in terms of how we treat each other and deal with each other. As more and more people come to realize from near-death experiences that life review is very much like having the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the very fabric of the universe. It's a very profound lesson in love, and the more people realize, well, this is part of the human condition, and that also that it involves coming back to this world again and again. This is what that work from UVA, UVADOPS.org is so important, the work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker on reincarnation, because it really kind of ups the game here. We must realize we're responsible for our choices. And of course, the work at UVA is not just interesting, from a scientific worldview perspective, but in fact, many in this world, beginning with Carl Jung, and then Charles Tart, Brian Weiss, Michael Newton, Stan Grof, and others, have developed the world of transpersonal psychology over the last few decades. And this is really just an expression that to fully understand our lives as human beings, we have to realize that we are souls, that we've been here before, and that in many ways prior lifetimes were what set the stage for the events of this lifetime. And the more we can kind of address that, use hypnotic regression, use meditation, start recovering past life memories, start making a richer sense of all of this for ourselves, for our own existence, that's where we can truly grow. Meditation, as I've said, a very profound way to get in there. Whatever your technique of meditation is, whatever it takes to quiet that little ego voice and kind of rise beyond the ego, because the ego, even though it certainly serves a certain purpose, in our function, it does not serve a purpose that helps us in trying to become more whole in a spiritual sense. And I've come to realize that all of our physical, mental, emotional health ultimately results from our spiritual health. And that spiritual has to do with our connectedness with others, that we're all part of this one mind, that we're all in this together, that ultimately our soul does the best to bring love, compassion, kindness, mercy, and acceptance, not only for self, and I will say it's very important to do that for self, because in many ways, my near-death journey showed me that the vast majority of the world's problems today are that we don't even love ourselves enough. And that is as the divine, sacred beings that we are. And this is not just about humans. Animals have a very rich spiritual life. That was something that was made clear to me on my journey, and certainly in many of the stories I've heard from other journeyers in the 12 years since my coma, it's become very clear. We're all spiritual beings sharing a spiritual existence. And a lot of the kind of sickness and disease in our society that results from that false sense of separation that emerges naturally from that materialist prejudice that we're just physical bodies and that there's nothing more to our life than birth to death, that's very misleading. And so I would say that this awakening that is coming to humanity now is one that offers tremendous promise for growth and coming into wholeness for all of us, to bring to this world, a far more harmonious, more prosperous, and more resonant world where we're all in this together. We're here to help each other. Gratitude, forgiveness when necessary, but every bit of this involves these deep soul lessons that ultimately originate in near-death experiences, but in the modern emerging science of consciousness, as much as it supports these kinds of stories and events. And the more that the medical community, nurses and doctors can open up to welcoming these stories from patients who have such extraordinary experiences, because they are very common. Questionnaires and polls indicate that probably somewhere around 5% of people in America, and in other countries, the number go anywhere from 4% to 15% of the population have had near-death experiences. So they are not uncommon. And yet they are just the tip of the iceberg in showing us something much deeper about our spiritual nature, about our connectedness with others, and how that truly, at the very base level of this universe, one of the deepest truths is the love, the kindness, the compassion that we encounter there. And that is really the ground of our being, and that is what we need to bring back to this world in large measure.
Dr. Alexander.
Yes.
This is time, if I can stop you, to begin discussion and to ask people to use their raise hand function. And I will call on the people for you, and then I'll ask individuals to unmute self. And
excellent. I think this is a perfect
good.
time. I
right.
was actually just going to invite the
Okay.
Q&A session. So I was at a natural kind of endpoint for my little address for the evening.
Okay. I am really doing this because I would like to have an equal representation of Bowen theory, Bowen thinkers here as well. So I'm going to invite Bowen theory thinkers who want to get in here to please do so, so that we can have a broad view here. So let me
Okay.
go here. I see Harold Lockett. If you'll unmute yourself and you can ask Dr. Alexander your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Alexander, for your very stimulating presentation tonight.
Thank you.
As you were talking, I made quite a few notes, but one of the, for the sake of brevity, I just want to ask one double-pronged question, and it's about prayer. Prayer before surgery. A lot of people think, that there's some very positive effects with prayer before surgery is administered. And also, along with that, what do you think about your family who prayed for you while you were going through your experience, and what all that meant to you, and to what did that mean for you as well?
Well, thank you. What I'd like to do is start with your second question, my family and that whole event. Prayer was a beautiful part of the experience. People who've read Proof of Heaven will realize I describe towards the end of it all, when I find that I can no longer access those higher spiritual realms, and now I've been kind of relegated and left in these lower murky realms, but they were now blessed with this incredible loving feeling. And that was a vision to me of thousands of beings going off into the distance. And I could see them with their heads down. Some were holding candles, some with hoods, off into the darkness. But this murmuring energy that they were putting out, and it was words I couldn't understand, but it was buoying me up in this incredibly blissful state that mimicked perfectly the joy and bliss I had felt in those higher spiritual realms, in the Gateway Valley, and especially in the core. And so to me, the miracle was witnessing this beautiful, comforting spiritual hominess and welcoming of all that prayer energy coming up from them. That's what I called it, was the energy of prayer. So to me, it was very obvious from inside my coma just how powerful that message was, and how comforting, and how it gets in. So that's one part of the answer. The other is, yes, I'm a firm believer in prayer. For me, centering prayer, which is, of course, a kind of a thy will be done form, not a supplicant requesting form. But for me, it's really my prayer ever since my coma has been one more of more of trusting the universe, and especially with this acknowledgement of our multiple incarnations and kind of this higher soul form, it's important to acknowledge that prayer, I think, has tremendous power. And I think if you read Dr. Harold Koenig's book on prayer, or Dr. Larry Dossey's book on healing words, you won't doubt the incredible efficacy and power proven with prayer in certain settings. Of course, it's hard to study scientifically, but the reality is I think prayer does play a tremendous role in healing. And I think praying before surgery, certainly. In fact, I often find I'm contacted by people whose family loved one is in coma, sometimes deep coma, maybe even brain dead. And I always encourage them to pray. Even if the loved one has left the physical world, the prayers can get through to their soul. And so I think prayer is a very important form of communication. And probably the biggest difference in my prayer before versus after my coma is, as I said, I have so much trust in the universe that my prayers now are really just a thy will, not mine be done, which is a trusting that the universe will take care of the highest and best goods, that God force will deliver the highest and best good to all involved, and that my soul will accept whatever that outcome is. But I've been very pleasantly surprised over the last 12 years how often that kind of form of prayer works for the better in terms of my loved ones and in terms of other people that I pray for.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Okay, Dr. Alexander, I see Kathleen Collie has her hand up.
Okay.
Go right ahead, Kathleen. Unmute yourself, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. So many things I'd like to say, but I would say, you know, in Bowen theory that Dr. Bowen believed that it was a fact that people believed, but that what they believed was not factual. And so it has opened a whole realm of interest in the intersection of science, religion, the supernatural, and Bowen theory. Over the years, we've had these wisdom of the ages meetings in the field, and there's an effort now to move toward that once again. But so that would be the first thing. The second thing I want to say, I've been very involved with animals my life, dogs, guide dogs specifically for the blind, and interested in the bond, the family of the blind person and the dog. And I've had these animals in my home, worked with them in public, at hospice and in church, but primarily in my clinical practice. And having the dog just present in the room and active in what Bowen theory might talk about, the triangles in a family. Dogs would play an active, they'd be part of the patterns of a family where they are interactive and they are on the family diagram, for instance, when they arrive and when they leave, and what is the function of these dogs in the system. So I was interested in what you had to say about animals having a rich spiritual life. Without going into detail, that has been my experience, particularly at hospice, just watching the animal move. If I can regulate myself in a way that lets the dog do the work. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, yes. Thanks for your observations and work with the assistance dogs. And I mean, I firmly believe, from my own experience, I know that we have two dogs, and I had dogs growing up, and relating to them is very easy. Of course, you have a friend in them. They understand you in very deep ways. I've seen animals behave in extraordinary fashion. For example, when my biological aunt lost her husband about 2 years ago, and they had a little dog that yapped and yapped and yapped and yapped, no matter who came to the door, no matter when, little sassy. And yet, when after he had passed, and when they brought, the funeral home brought his urn of ashes to the front door, Sassy knew it was him. I mean, she didn't yap at all. She knew, and she was acting. I know the way Dale described it. You know, the dog knew, and I'm certainly aware of cases like in certain hospice settings where they use cats just for that purpose. Some of the cats will know who the next soul will be to pass over. And so I think animals have a very rich spiritual awareness. I know when we lost one of our beloved dogs about 5 years ago, the other dog knew it, even though there was no way they should have known it. But they came running into the house after that the other dog had passed, and they went running over to where that dog normally slept, and they wouldn't leave that spot for hours, and just kind of in the sad mope, they knew what was going on. So I think that animals can have a very rich kind of relationship. I know one of my colleagues, Dr. Alan Hamilton, who's another neurosurgeon, he's done a lot of work with horses for healing, as therapy animals after a stroke or things like that. So I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence that animals can have a rich spiritual kind of essence and presence and existence, and it overlaps with ours. So the more we can kind of honor that and use it, the better. Of course, it has tremendous implications for our, say, our farming and our food procurement practices, because I would say right now they completely violate any kind of sensible, humane vision of how we should be treating other animals. And I think that is, from my point of view, a major part of our society that needs addressing, is that whole industry, the way animals are handled.
Thank you very much. I'll let others have a chance here.
Thank you, Kathleen.
There's Ron Bacon is next. Mr. Bacon, do you want to? There you are.
Kind of in the shadows. Here we go.
Ron?
Hi. I'm interested in your use of when you're talking about the soul. In Bowen family theory, we talk about differentiating a self, the solid self, core self, the real self are ways of trying to get at what that is. Do you see those as synonymous, or do you mean something different when you say soul?
Well, for me, soul is really kind of that essence of a personality that would come through, a lifetime or through multiple lifetimes, that preserves a certain strand of kind of karmic debt, or of knowledge, or of transformation in a process of evolution. Important to point out that in this kind of way of looking at reincarnation, it's not like a Buddhist system of kind of a blind mechanistic wheel of suffering that you're trying to get off of. In fact, one of the visions I had in my journey, given that I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, so I could not have an Eben Alexander life review, but I saw life reviews in very profound fashion. And one of those visions that occurred in the core realm it's a vision that I refer to as the Indra's net vision, because it reminds me of that kind of teaching and concept from ancient Eastern spiritual traditions. But it showed this tapestry of all these interwoven threads, and I could see kind of the individual soul life of each of those threads, kind of in and out of incarnations. But it all led to this glorious golden center. It was, in many ways, I would say the best way to understand that is to look back at Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's book in the mid-20th century, The Phenomenon of Man. And in that book, he takes concepts of evolution, at that time, of course, kind of Darwinian evolution, but he took them much further and basically said all of this universe exists for the evolution of consciousness itself. And that's what I believe is going on. And we're all contributing to that. So the reason the universe exists is for consciousness to evolve. And that is nothing more, just like that old saying, all politics is local. That's nothing more than individual sentient beings going through this process of growth and transformation, which is really just learning their relationship with the universe. Know thyself. That's kind of the prime directive. And so I would say that my view of the soul is that one kind of traceable element that contains experience, memory of experience, can include memories of past lives, everything we experience both in this material world and in our dream space and in our unconscious lives. Every bit of that adds to this kind of soul consciousness. But in many ways, it also, then at its deepest level, overlaps with that primordial mind, with that God force that so many near-death experiencers have been comforted by. And I believe all of us can access that in prayer and meditation. I know people who've had profound kind of Kundalini awakenings and spiritual awakenings in deep meditation. And certainly many of those never had a near-death experience. So I think just as conscious sentient beings, we all have the power to access this at kind of that soul level. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, because I'm sorry, I don't really know the definitions of the various soul types in the Bowen system. But what I do know is kind of what I look at is that soul line, and then how it basically is a dance between the kind of ego mind and our kind of consciousness in this material realm, as well as that aspect of higher soul that we can connect with, through meditation, et cetera, by going within and realizing that ego is little more than a parlor trick, and then start connecting with a soul that's much more connected to the higher good for all.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, Dr. Bowen, I'm not aware of him using the word soul often, if ever. I'm just not, so I'm not sure, it's certainly there's a lot of different interpretations out there, that's all, and
Okay.
so
Well,
it can be
that's a very
rather,
good point. And
you
I'll tell you another thing about my whole process in the last many years of assimilating this is I've come to realize the linguistic brain, as Rene Descartes said, to define is to limit.
Hmm.
And so for me, I'm much more of a lumper than a splitter.
Mhm.
And that's why I tend to even conflate mind and consciousness, and my use of the words are pretty much synonymous. But I think soul is, for me, a pretty important concept of maintaining kind of a line of experience and memory that leads to potential growth for a sentient being.
Mhm. Mhm.
So,
And the whole spiritual aspect with in work with addictions, somebody who is going to have sobriety versus abstinence is going to have some experience with something greater than the obsession that they've been having for the drug. And that's something that each person has to discover, whether they do that through an organized religion, whether they do that through nature, whether in some way, but to have an experience with God is essential.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's very true. And of course, that gets back to, what I mentioned during the talk about the use of psilocybin in the treatment of fear of death and the treatment of very severe addictions. And just one dose can have a tremendous effect in the proper therapeutic setting. From my point of view, it's not really the psilocybin that's doing it as much as the opening of the veil to kind of higher soul, to which I believe is what we get exposed to in those kind of experiences. Even though the psychedelic experience is not the best way to do it, I think meditation is a far more powerful way to connect with that God force and with that kind of higher self that actually has the ability to heal. That's what all this placebo effect and the spontaneous remission that I've been talking about is an example, by the thousands they're out there in the literature of beliefs and attitudes and thoughts playing a tremendous role in our physical, mental, and emotional health, essentially. But I think you're right. In essence, it's getting in touch with that God force. To me, that's what that primordial mind is. And the more powerfully we can kind of nurture our connection and relationship with that force, the more effective we are at growing as a soul and bringing that kind of love and healing and wholeness into this world for self and for others. So I think that's, again, it's some of this is about linguistics, definition of God, consciousness, but in many ways, this kind of simplified system allows it all to flow pretty readily.
Dr. Alexander, there are two more questions.
Okay.
See if we can fit them in the
All
last
right.
10 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Gail Thompson. Thank you, Mr. Bacon.
Thanks, Ron.
Hi, Dr. Alexander. Thank you for sharing your messages, particularly as a man of science, to come out. I really benefited from reading your book aloud to my father as he was dying.
Thank
And
you.
I'm curious why you think we forget our oneness and our soulness and become entrapped in ego and material existence. Why
I
do we
think,
forget all of that? Why don't we know
I
what
think,
we're here for?
I think we need to remember the ego does serve a purpose, you know, especially in the dance of predator and prey. There's something about this kind of self-awareness, and it's a self-awareness that's also focused on the material world around us. And those are the parts where our ego is really not helping us in growing. And yet, in a lot of ways, you know, we have skin in the game by the emotional buy-in. That is, if we had all the knowledge of our higher soul fully living these lives, knowing that we were eternal spiritual beings, we wouldn't necessarily be behaving the way in how we treat ourselves and others. So I think there's a benefit certainly to kind of rising above the ego in the meditation prayers I'm saying, because that allows us to have that kind of higher vision of self in relation to other selves and realize that we're really all in this together. So there's a tremendous value in this kind of awakening. And yet, you know, in some ways you're also asking, why do we have that programmed forgetting? Why is it, you know, Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson, the doctors who study these children and their past life memories, say that beyond age 5 or 6, it gets very difficult. Those memories get covered over. It's a natural process of forgetting. So I believe most of us as young children have these kind of memories that tie us to the spiritual realm, tie us, for example, to family who might have passed over already, like grandparents and things like that. So we have those kind of connections early on, but then for whatever reason, we kind of lose all that. And then we kind of buy into this life. And I think the emotional engagement is very important. It's not to be denied. And yet, in many ways in meditation, I find that I'm often kind of rising above that. I embrace the emotional engagement because that helps to teach me certain things about this life and about myself and about my relationship with the universe. So in many ways, it's a process of growth and transformation that involves both the buying into this kind of material life, but also that spiritual essence that we can glean through spontaneous epiphanies, through NDEs, through kind of dream work and through meditative work, I think ends up playing a very important role in helping us to grow to the higher souls that we came here to be.
Odd rules of the game. Why do we have to forget? Why is it set up this way? Why do we have to learn through this means?
Well, I'm not sure why, but I've certainly come to realize that the hardships and difficulties in life in many ways map the pathway forward. These are milestones of our soul growth. In fact, you can really say that our free will only manifests when we can rise above the ego. The ego, you could argue, just has a kind of a mechanistic automatonic response to certain things. And that's especially darkness and challenge. Whereas as we unite with higher soul and start to have this bigger vision of self and purpose for existence to basically learn about our relationship with the universe, it allows us to grow into kind of a much higher form that benefits from those hardships and challenges, grows from them, uses them to energize our transformation as a soul. I mean, for me, that was a very important recognition of my experience, was the value and the importance of the hardships in life. Illness, injury, these are all gifts in many ways. And the more we can come to see our lives as unfolding in that fashion, I think the better we can do with growing to be the souls we came here to be.
Thank you.
I think we
you.
can get in one more. It's a gentleman who, I'm not sure if you'll just state your name. It says iPhone, sir.
Oh, it's maybe Vincent Randy.
Vincent?
Hi. Yes.
How are you?
Hi. Thank you. I'm very good. Can you say a bit more about the term dissociation that you used to talk about this question that was just asked?
Right.
So
well, you know, so in this kind of worldview we're developing, one sees primordial consciousness, that primordial mind out of which everything originates, and then sees our physical body and brain, and the brain is serving as a filter, you know, to reduce that consciousness down to this more limited form that we see as kind of a personal conscious awareness. And sorry, I lost my train of thought, but your question was about the
term dissociation in
the
relation to this
dissociation,
process.
exactly. And so then the question is, well, how does this primordial mind differentiate out into these kind of apparently individual selves? Now, I again will refer to that life review because the most common description of life review in NDEs, and these are out there literally by the millions, is that you experience it from the perspective of others around you who are affected by your own thoughts and actions. So in other words, the life review is a perfect example of how we are not truly ourselves. Our boundaries of self are apparent when we're in these bodies living these lives, but at a deeper level, we're much more kind of the one mind living this. Now you might ask, well, how is it that in the past life memories in children that they seem to have kind of a soul line? So in other words, it does seem to be that there's a certain viscosities to the soul. So even if in this between life realm, you're having this blurring of the boundaries of self, and you're realizing how much this is a drama that involves all of us kind of interacting. But I like to use the words, it's like sharing the dream of the one mind. But this is a dream of progression and advance. But then the question is, how do we have those separations of soul? And that is something that recently has come up in some discussions that I partake in, especially around quantum physics and the work of Bernardo Kastrup. And I would highly encourage anyone interested to check out Bernardo Kastrup with a K.com to learn more about that. But he and John Climo proposed this about 20 years ago, that the way this whole mechanism works is that consciousness can naturally dissociate into these individual branches that each and every one of us perceive as our own individual consciousness. Now, of course, in mental health, you can also have multiple personality disorder in someone, and that's postulated to be a differentiation of their consciousness into separate modules. And it's interesting when you study people in those cases, specifically using something like functional MRI, you find that the brain in the patient starts to behave like the mind that is currently occupying, and that changes of associative into another associative or a dissociative version of self leads to a whole different fMRI. So it's interesting how the brain seems to respond to these kind of changes in mentation, even to the point of showing different dissociated forms of consciousness in a given patient. But I think that whole principle of dissociation is something that is also operative at this larger scale that allows for us to have this semblance of our own mind. And yet, if you check carefully with things like remote viewing, things like telepathy, or like, say, the Gansfeld used in the dream studies back in the late 20th century, where you actually can show that this dissociation is something that can happen naturally in those pathological situations, but also occurs naturally in differentiating that primordial mind between you and me and other sentient beings who claim to have their own kind of mental processes. So it's that dissociation in several different forms that we're talking about there. But I believe that would explain the dissociation of mind into the apparent separate sentient beings that we all seem to assume is there. But again, when you look more deeply, you realize that there's more overlap and kind of crossover of those mental experiences than we normally believe to be the case.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. I think Ann Curran has, is your hand up for closing, Ann, or do you actually have a question? Because we're out of time.
I know we're out of time.
Okay, great.
But I did have my hand up for a thought or a question,
Okay.
and I can do both.
Go for it.
One is, I remember from your first book how touch was a part of your family's decision to be with you while you were in coma.
Mhm.
In other words, 24 hours a day, one family or another family would hold your hand. Now, you weren't conscious of that, but it happened. And people do respond to touch emotionally or intrinsically. It just happens.
Mhm.
So that was one question. And it was also related to a question about energy force and how does that work in this? And maybe you
Sorry,
don't have
energy
time.
force?
Well, just emotional energy, consciousness energy, spiritual energy, human energy, because we as human beings and animals, as Kathleen Collie mentioned, they sense something in each other. That's an
Right.
energy force. That's what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
And you may not have time to get into that, but that's kind of where my questions were coming from. And of course, I was intrigued by the story you gave in that book about your birth sister who had died, and you never knew her, never knew about her at that time because you did your family research on your birth family post experience with NDE.
Right.
So that's what triggered me to be interested in your writing, because that was beyond knowledge in any context that you knew.
Right. Well, that's a very important point. Of course, that's what got my attention. That's kind of the way the book Proof of Heaven comes to an end, was my
Right.
realizing that identity of that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing. It was a very profound experience. And you're exactly right. You mentioned earlier about touch. Now, I have no personal memory
Right.
of that touch, but of course they told me about it. And I firmly believe that it was an important part of my staying anchored to this world and coming back to this world. My family, I remember it was the first night I was in coma. My son had driven 5 hours down from college. My youngest sister had driven up 4 hours from the south. They converged at about 11:30 that night. And when my younger sister Phyllis first got to the room, and she actually, the nurse had just stepped out and she saw me in there on a ventilator alone. And that's when she made a big deal with the nurses and said, can one of us be here holding his hand all the time? And the nurses were excellent. They did their very best to allow a family member there. And I'm convinced in my mind that touch had a tremendous role to play in kind of keeping me anchored to this world.
Mm-hmm.
And you had mentioned about energy, the psychic energy, the kind of human energy. I think this is absolutely a form of energetic exchange that occurs between us in prayer and in healing touch and all of that. There's a tremendous amount of kind of an energy exchange, and it's not the word that I often use. I mean, for me, as a scientist, in many ways, it's more about information. There are certain laws of energy conservation that become problematic, especially when you're discussing models of brain, mind, and consciousness. And for me, it's much more facile to be discussing passages of information than necessarily energy. But really, again, that's just semantics. It's truly about a deep kind of resonant energy. I think this is why we can have so much overlap in knowledge of kind of the spiritual energy of animals, for example. It's an information kind of overlay and a resonance of information where we end up kind of fully kind of knowing their spiritual energy and they know ours through this kind of overlap and constructive interference of information.
Thank
I
you
think
so much.
ultimately that's what it is. Thank you, and
I think
thank you
we
all
have to
very
close
much for
down, but
having
let me
me.
give a couple of quick announcements.
Uh-huh.
One is March 19th. There is an ethics meeting for professionals who wish to get CEUs to accommodate their ethics responsibilities. In April 9 and 10, we have the spring conference. The title of that is Unlocking the Mystery of Family Emotional History. So that should be quite interesting. And preceding that on April the 5th, which is a Monday night. So please just know that. This group will meet again, or the professional lecture series will meet again and highlight Libby Copeland, who has written a book called The Lost Family, and it's about DNA testing and how that's altered people's families, in fact, and concept of family. So please come to that. That would be quite interesting. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to leave them here or contact the Family Center. And they can give you my email address if necessary. Thank you so much for the evening. And thank you so much, Dr. Alexander, for spending this time with us. It was rich.
Well, thank you all at the Bowen Center. It's been my pleasure, and would love to hear from any of you. Reach out to me at ebenalexander.com. You can learn more about the meditation at sacredacoustics.com. And for any of the mental health practitioners, as I said, becomingmorewhole.com is all the information to that course that we did with Dr. Anna Newsom. Thank you all very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.